Welcome back to The Craft. I'm Carter, and I'm here with my good friend Colby. And today we are talking about the artistic subject, which we are we are directly taking this from Steven Pressfield's framework that Colby's going to give us a little bit of an intro to, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm so excited, man. There's a book called The Artist's Journey, and we've talked about that in the past. You can go back and check out that episode. But Steven Pressfield wrote this book, and it ties in how the hero's journey is similar to, or how the artist's journey is similar to the hero's journey or the monomyth, that idea in literature. And so he's got this quote that stuck out to me in the book, and I just wanted to do an episode on it. And really, it's kind of turning into more than one episode, but it's a sort of framework or mental model for what are all the things that make up an artist. So let me just read it real quickly. Subject, voice, point of view, medium of expression, and style is an aspect of the single question, what is my gift? Which is itself another way of asking, who am I? So I know that's kind of it's a weird quote to kind of pull out of context, but the way that it's worded, but I think it's such a good question. Like the way that you can ask, who am I as an artist, is by looking at these five different things: subject, voice, point of view, medium of expression, and style. Some of them are super obvious, like medium of expression. It's like, okay, I'm a musician. But then subject, what we're going to talk about today, is a little bit more, like, what is my subject? And it's even, he acknowledges in the book, most people don't sit down and think, okay, what's my subject? The subject is sort of this thing this thread that weaves throughout the body of work of an artist. And so it's more in the shadows or the background, but it just keeps coming up. It's those themes and those ideas. But that's what I think. What do you think subject is?
So what was helpful for me was the excerpt that you had from the book about Martin Scorsese. And so Pressfield lists out a bunch of movies: Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, Goodfellas, Cape Fear, Gangs of New York, Shutter Island, Wolf of Wall Street. And then he says something like, did Martin Scorsese just sit down and ask himself, what is my subject? I doubt it. Which is, I think this is a really nice introduction to it, because you can trace, like you said, those common themes, even if like the subject matter itself is changing. Like one is set in, on an island, obviously, one set in New York, but there are common motifs, common themes, common interests that kind of work to bring a cohesion to the work. And so I don't think subject is subject matter. What do you think about that?
I mean, like the subject matter is the actual tangible thing you're creating about, and then the subject is that, I think, that thread that weaves through the art that's more vague, or is more like the word theme keeps coming to mind for me.
Yeah, it's more intangible, whatever it is. But I think it's the sense of, it's kind of related to style, I think. It's a sense of, okay, if you see a Scorsese film and you're familiar with his films, you've got this sense of, this is Scorsese. And so I think the subject sometimes can have some overlap with subject matter. So a lot of, for instance, Cormac McCarthy's novels are based in the American Southwest. So there is some overlap in subject matter, but it's not exhaustively that. It can be something like a protagonist who's struggling to get out of debt, and we see that played out again, or the protagonist that's got a tendency towards, you name it, right? And we see that play out again. Or a greed, or, you name whatever the central concept or tension gets played out again and again. And so I don't know if there's like a distinct line between subject matter and subject, because I'm trying to disentangle subject from style. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think,
because they might overlap.
Maybe they overlap, but without trying to be too precise, I think that subject, in the way that Pressfield's talking about it, is like the maybe it even gets into the purpose of why you create something, but it's the ideas that drive your art. So I want to like get tangible for a second, because it'll help me. I'm pulling up Spotify. I'm going to look at John Bellion's page. He's my favorite producer. just looking at his popular release or look at his albums here. So translation through speakers, the separation, the definition, the human condition, glory sound prep. 5 albums. I just at a high level, like looking at the last 2, human condition, you've got songs about New York, his kind of like upbringing, high school, overwhelming love, his wife, weight of the world. There's a lot of talk about anxiety. There's talk about just culture, and there's a kind of mixture, definitely some faith in there. There's a mixture of different topics, I guess, but there's some different some things that tie together throughout there. Social issues, faith, family and legacy, grappling with the mistakes of the past, trying to be a better man. Just there's a number of different things inside of that body of work. I don't know, does that help with this definition of subject? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like that we're turning towards the practical, and maybe we both kind of made some lists here. So maybe let's just talk about those briefly, just like you did for Bellion. Why don't you list off a couple, and then I'll list off a couple, and we'll see if we can get to a better understanding of what exactly subject is.
Yeah, I didn't take a lot of time on this, so I feel like I need to think through it live. But I just put some of my favorite artists on here. Justin Bieber. I've gotten into him a lot more the past few years, and I think the main topics you can see in his music, obviously, I mean, he's a pop artist, and so I think love and romance are a pretty common pop theme. But then there's also the theme of faith throughout his work, especially more recently the past few years. And then there's I mean, that's honestly all I thought for that. It was pretty straightforward. It was like, those are the topics. Does he have thoughts outside of that? Of course. But it's like interesting to think, like one thing that comes up for me in this is just because every person has opinions and thoughts in every realm of life to some regard. Obviously, we don't all care about the same things to the same degree, but it's like you'll notice as you look through this list, as we list these different people, there's overlap between the artists, but then there's also some separation and some just like, oh, this artist doesn't talk about those things, you know? Like this artist doesn't talk about certain topics necessarily. They stay in a certain lane. Just like podcasts will stay in a certain lane of what they talk about and what we talk about in this show versus what we talk about offline, you know? So it's interesting to see that just because you have an opinion on something doesn't mean that it has to fit into your work per se as a main
Yeah, and I think you get
grasped
grasped by some of these subjects. I mean, Pressfield says you were born with it. You'll discover it on your artist's journey. I think some of these are just artistic, for maybe not lack of a better word, muses that you're just interested in, and they just keep reappearing, and you keep investigating them, and they lead to other things, and then you integrate those things. So I think in some ways, it's this artistic curiosity that forms a constellation. And so some interests aren't in there, but the artistic, like you were saying, the artistic subject forms a constellation of interests, maybe. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I love that analogy. I think this is really well said. Really well said. I'm going to switch to a movie director here, Christopher Nolan. And I threw his name down. I don't passionately follow his art or anything, but I love his movies. So I was like, I'll throw it down. But yeah, so Christopher Nolan, I didn't write any notes down. I'm just thinking out loud. His art really ties into futuristic ideas, mind-bending, technology and experiences, like mystical or magical or futuristic experiences. So it's very, futuristic is the first word that comes to mind, but it's very based in intensity, drama, almost dreamlike. And of course, I'm thinking of Inception when I say that, but even the Batman movies and I should pull up his list of movies. Let's see. And there's even Dunkirk and what's the other one? All right, sorry, let me pull up his list here. Yes, The Dark Knight, Interstellar, Tenet, Inception, Dunkirk, Oppenheimer, The Dark Knight Rises, Memento, Batman Begins, The Prestige, Insomnia, Following. So that's from 1998 to up to 2023. I guess Oppenheimer's not out yet. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but there's definitely a darker theme to them overall. You can see there's a heaviness and also a lot of science and technology and futuristic things as well.
I think it's helpful just to give these threads that we pick up in people's work. So, I had Steinbeck down, and he talks about human relationships with the land, with each other, talks about the humanity that's underneath politics, the downtrodden, whether it be the Okies on the way to California, or it be Mac and the boys who are downtrodden, but they're kind of just hanging around Cannery Row. Cormac McCarthy, philosophy-centered, fate, freedom, this tragic idea, the human condition, violence, sublimity. Someone like Roger Scruton, the philosopher, beauty, culture, architecture. It's just interesting how quickly I was able to do that this morning. Like just looking at this list of, okay, what are the things that capture the attention? So maybe that's, to kind of bring it back to the subject, your subject is that constellation of artistic interests. And I think it's constantly changing, right? You're constantly rearranging it. You're constantly drawing the lines differently. But oftentimes it seems like we've got this fixation on a certain arrangement or a certain part of the potential galaxy of things that you could be interested in.
A North Star.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I think there's something there. It's like you're on our journey making more things. We're sort of, maybe we're moving a little bit to the right, a little to the left, a little up, a little down, and we're just finding our path. And I don't think that Christopher Nolan, going back since we just read his whole list of movies, I don't think he knew what movie he'd be doing in 12 years, But then with each one, you learn some new things and you change a little and you keep growing. And it's like one thing leads to the next. And then you look back and there is maybe hindsight is more 2020 there of seeing a thread of things. But I'm sure that there's definite intentionality to building a body of work as excellent as that too. So I think just because, that Pressfield quote says like most people don't sit down and contemplate their subject, I don't think it means that we shouldn't,
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, Christopher Nolan's not going to do a rom-com with Matthew McConaughey.
Exactly.
He's not going to direct that.
Yeah.
And so I think there is some selectivity, which is interesting to think about too.
Exactly. Yeah. That's that really fascinates me. Like, how do you get to that place where you can be like, easy, no, that's not me. And I know who I am. And that's really what it goes back to the first quote. Who am I?
Yeah. I think this ties in well with one of the tensions that I wanted to talk about in this episode, which is the idea that you'll hear people give the advice to create what you know. So in the creative writing world, write what you know. You have a certain set of experiences and standpoints, write that. What's interesting is there are a bunch of really heavyweight writers. So from Kazuo Ishiguro to Toni Morrison to Hemingway to Ursula Le Guin, who all vehemently disagree with this idea. So there's this great quote from Ishiguro who says, "Write about what you know is the most stupid thing I've heard. It encourages people to write a dull autobiography. It's the reverse of firing the imagination and potential of writers." And again, this is talking about fiction. So creative nonfiction is going to be different, and we can talk about the differences in medium. But I just thought it was interesting that we've got this kind of broader, what's your subject going to be? It's probably going to be something you know. And here are these writers, Toni Morrison teaching her creative writing students at Princeton. She said they've been told all their lives to write what they knew. And I always began the course by saying, don't pay attention to that. First, because you don't know anything. And second, because I don't want to hear about your true love, your mama and your papa and your friends, which is such a great quote. But it's this idea of where does the subject come from? And it's not necessarily just the encounters and experiences that you have. And I think for both writers, and maybe you could talk about this for musicians, this can be a temptation to just rely on things that you've experienced or like you're looking for something to write about, and all you've got, I mean, maybe you don't have any massive event, maybe you don't have any jaw-dropping story or something like that, and so you end up writing what Ishiguro calls the dull autobiography. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard another version of this, which is just, if I always did what I was qualified to do at work, I would still be sweeping, like, and no knock on doing that. That is valuable work and that's a good thing. But like, if you never learn the next skill set, even if you continue to do that first thing, life is constantly learning to do things you are not qualified for. That's the whole idea. And I think it's kind of like with art, there's this fear of I can only create what I've already made before, or what I've experienced. And that literally limits you to never be as good as you could be. So, I mean, even just thinking about, okay, I want my music to be as good as John Bellion's. Well, I've never made something as good as John Bellion's. So I can't do it, or I have to strive to do something I've never done before. I mean, that's the only answer, is strive to do something you haven't done yet,
Yeah, and I think it opens up let's go back to the metaphor as we typically do. It opens up more potential stars that you can add to the constellation. Because if it's not a matter of your direct experience and your life memories, if that's not the only pull that you can draw from, then all of a sudden I think that opens up so many different artistic possibilities. So I agree, right? The only way you're going to grow is by doing the thing that you haven't done. I think Picasso actually says something like that. He's like, I'm constantly doing what I can't do so I can learn how to do it. Some paraphrase of that sentiment idea.
Right.
But it's also, Jack London, for instance, he has a crazy pool of personal experience he could draw from. He's an oyster pirate at 14. He's on a seal hunting ship in Japan when he's 17. He's up in the Klondike looking for gold in his late teens and early 20s. He comes back and he writes, and he's got a massive personal catalog of crazy experiences and places. That might not be the case for you. Right? It's not the case for me. I've got things that I interact with day to day that I think are important and significant, like relationships I have and places that I've lived. But I think there's a trap in trying to just use those, or feel like you have to use those, or you're not qualified to do anything else.
Okay, so I agree, but I feel like there's this other thing that we talk about sometimes that's been really encouraging to me, which is like, sometimes you need to step away from art and you need to just live life, and you do need to get experiences, and you need to go through things, and you need to build that well or reservoir of experiences. So you've gone through these emotional experiences, tangible ones in the world. You've seen nature, you've read books, you've been exposed to great art, so you know what is great art. Like, that's really important. We can't put that aside, right? I mean, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think experience like we've talked about will become, fodder or fuel for the kind of creativity. But I think the thing that these fiction writers are trying to get at is the idea that we unlock a different kind of potential when we step outside of our experiences. So in the Toni Morrison quote, she says, don't record or editorialize on some event that you've already lived through. I was amazed at how effective this was. They were always out of the box when they were given license to imagine something wholly outside of their existence. I thought it was a good training for them. And so here's Morrison's just absolute master saying there's something that gets unlocked when we really try to get outside of ourselves. And I mean, for fiction, I think this is especially the case. And there can be a case made for nonfiction's different, right? There's creative nonfiction.
That's my question.
And it's its own thing, right? It's going to be directly related to your experience. But there's something about, especially in literature, anytime you're writing a character, anytime you're trying to inhabit another mind, you're doing this act. I mean, you're pretending, you're trying to present the consciousness of somebody else, and you don't know what that's like. But that's the whole point, right? The whole point in a lot of ways of literature is that you're getting to experience the position that's not your own. You're getting to inhabit the other and see that from a distance. And there's this involvement that's not about you that we just get drawn back to again and again. And so I don't know how this translates to music, but maybe it's trying something, a different genre. I don't know. Maybe that's not where you land, but it's generative in a way.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like for me, what's coming to mind is maybe there's a lot of pressure when you're writing a song, and I'm sure it's true with writing, nonfiction or whatever it is, even fiction. But there's a sense of fear and pressure whenever you're writing from personal experience. For me personally, like it's vulnerable. It exposes parts of you that maybe you haven't talked about before, or even the ones that you have talked about. It just puts it in a very public form in a song that's going to always be out there, And so it's like very vulnerable versus writing stories from the point, like writing fictional stories. Like I'm thinking of maybe in electronic music. I think that's probably really common. Just building, maybe it is from personal experiences, I can't say, but building these worlds in music, electronic music is very like fantastical, and just the themes are like love and just a lot of romance and breakups and heartache and struggle in electronic music. And a lot of times it feels like everything's a little bit magical, a little bit like over the top, fantasized in a way, if that's the right word. And so you see sort of like, I could see that being a place where writing music and saying, I don't have to have an experience that's true, I can just make up something, would be probably really freeing creatively. Like, I'm just going to make up a breakup story. It's not my story. Or I'm going to make a song about love. Is not my story. I don't know. There's something interesting about the idea of like making up worlds and stories and different relationships, and the freedom that you don't have to be able to say this is true and fit a true story into like the creative work. Like if you need to tweak some words, you don't have to worry about being truthful to the original account. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and so I think the Ursula Le Guin quote fits well with this. Her response to this, "Write what you know," was to say, "I think it's a good rule. I've written about imaginary countries and alien societies and dragons and wizards. I know these things. I know them better than anyone else could." And so she kind of takes it tongue in cheek, but it's the idea that, yeah, the imagination allows for you to try things that you wouldn't do and test things out. And it's just, I mean, it sounds kind of, I don't know, trite to say, but the imagination has got this deep playfulness and even some seriousness to think about different ways to approach life that aren't your own, and try those out and see what happens when you put these different things together. Or if you're going to do that electronic song, write it about something that you don't know anything about, or you know very little about, and see what happens. And so I think it's compelling in some ways, and in some ways, right, I think you have to have some sort of knowledge, but it's a weird interplay between knowledge and the imagination. And I think that's kind of that's a cross point that's very central, I think, to the craft, this podcast as a whole, the artistic pursuit. Somehow the imagination combines with knowledge. And I think you could go wrong either way. You can get really cerebral with it, where you're very much suppressing this playfulness, this experimentation, this risk taking, I think is one that you use there. Or, right, you can kind of put that down and suppress it and become too scattered. And there's not enough substance and there's not enough knowledge that's being brought to the imagination. So I don't know. Those two things in my mind are kind of in tandem.
They're actually, that literally ties into this book I've got right here. So I've been reading this book, Build by Tony Fadell, an unorthodox guide to making things worth making. It's a great book. anyone interested in just like making products or starting companies or whatever, that it's kind of businessy, but he also made the first iPod. So there's just some interesting stories in there. And so, yeah, there's this idea in in a chapter called Why Storytelling. And he says, in storytelling, this is for business context, but in storytelling, you need information, or you need facts, and you need emotions. The facts, without the facts, you just have kind of this, feely thing that doesn't have any substance to it. And so people are like, oh, okay, I feel good, but this isn't real. And then if you just have a bunch of facts, but you have no emotion, people, in this case, it's like people won't buy. They won't care. You didn't get them to act or to share that song with their friend or to actually talk about you to someone else, because there's no feeling to it. And he said, but interestingly, sometimes it's going to be the fact that you share that makes someone feel emotional. And sometimes it's going to be the emotion that you share that's kind of a fact and is that tangible cerebral piece that you talked about. So it's interesting that that's sort of like two-piece idea. Like maybe in art, there's the content and this like actual substance of like, is this writing telling me something that's true or interesting or valuable? And then there's the like, how does it make me feel?
Totally.
That's pretty cool.
I think that maps on perfect to, Aristotle's understanding of rhetoric, with pathos being the use of emotion and logos being the use of fact and logic. And one of the things that I tell my students when I teach those concepts, you've got events in life and pretty much all sorts of moments of rhetoric that you have to have both of them. And so the example that I'll often use is if I was a reporter trying to communicate, let's say, the Vietnam War. Well, on one hand, I can give the facts that are important, the casualties, the places, the movements, what's happening on the ground. But if it was just the facts, that wouldn't be very persuasive. I would miss something. I also need to recount the personal experiences of people who were there, right? And so the emotion in this case, if I was going to create a piece of rhetoric, let's say an anti-war rhetoric or something like that, right, you would need to use, and this is what Aristotle's attuned to, you would need to use emotion, not in a misleading way, but in order to encompass and characterize and describe the event fully. Because to ignore emotion would be to basically reduce your picture, but to ignore the facts would also be to reduce the picture. And so I think it's like you've got to combine those, and how you combine them seems to be the challenge for the artist and the challenge for the producer and the challenge for the marketer. I mean, you kind of name it. There's a tension there, but the tension, I think, propels us forward in a way.
So the $1 million question in this episode is, what is your artistic subject? Do you feel like you're starting to trace one? Because we're both I feel like relatively young and early in the pursuit. So do you feel like you have some themes? I think we maybe talked about this for like 2 or 3 minutes on another episode.
Yeah. Why does this sound familiar? I think we did talk about this.
I think, yeah, maybe we did, but maybe not everyone's heard.
Sure.
So let's do it again.
Sure.
Because I see some themes for sure, but what do you think they are?
Yeah. I think it just depends on what genre of work I think I'm engaging. So like scholarly, I'm really interested in ideas of ontology, which is kind of how we think about being, of aesthetics, of beauty, of how those go together. So thinkers like Heidegger and William Desmond, and which I'm really enjoying. William Desmond's kind of new on the slate, about dwelling, about the environment, about our connection to place and people and rurality, being outdoors, fishing. I made a giant switch. I moved from scholarly to more nonfiction things pretty quickly there. But that shows you how closely I think they're combined in my mind. And I love the places that they can kind of bleed over. But that's where I feel myself kind of starting to root down. And maybe that's another metaphor we can throw at people. Like you start to put in some roots And then when you find a spot it starts going down and less going out. What about you?
No, I need to think about that. Yeah. Oh man. It's like on the one hand, like talking about this, if I'm just thinking music, it's like I haven't made enough music to know. Because what's interesting is like as a producer, it's my job to help other people figure out their subject.
That's interesting.
You know? So it's which to be fair, I don't always participate. I actually pretty rarely participate in the songwriting aspect, and that's really where the subject comes out. What I participate in is more leading, like how does this fit into a genre, or how does this break rules of a genre? You know, so if you want to do a specific hip hop track, okay, what style is that? What maybe there's a subgenre to fit into, or maybe there's just, I mean, typically this just is like, what 2 or 3 songs do you want to sound like, and wherever that leads, you know, whenever you're working on a project.
Yeah,
that's often like practically how it happens.
And I feel like you've got like a specific subgenre and genre that you stay into. I mean, I could guess some of those, but what were you going to say?
Yeah, but it's funny because I haven't made a lot of music this year for myself. Actually, very little, if any, really. So it's like the last piece of work that I put out was the self-titled EP, Shem, and that was electronic, very heavily influenced and inspired by Odessa and a bunch of other kind of like electronic artists that I was listening to at the time. Like there's one called Petite Biscuit. I mean, I've always really loved Skrillex. That's different. That's like dubstep more so. Although some of his stuff is more general. There's electronic. I don't even have a good grip on all the subgenres and stuff. There's some crazy amount of subgenres like down tempo and all these other things. But essentially electronic but that's really going back to this framework. It's like, that's more the genre. So that kind of fits into style more so than subject, you know, like that's why I say I don't feel like I've put out enough songs to even figure out what is the subject, like what's the theme. And even the songs, that project only had lyrics on a couple songs. There's some themes of faith, some themes of just interest in nature, themes of what else? There's also just other songs I put out. There's been romance, and I put out one song that's more like R&B. So that going back to the style, it's definitely more heavily influenced by R&B. That's when I was listening to like Daniel Caesar a lot, trying to sound like him. He's amazing. And so all that to say, I think it's like coming across this whole quote about subject, voice, point of view, medium, and style was like, I just want to reflect on that and really have more clarity around music. Like, what are the things in music that I want to lean into? Because even talking to someone this week, they were saying, he was like, you know, you should kind of ask yourself, like next year, we were talking about planning the next year. What do you want to work on in 2023? He's like, you should ask yourself, you know, what do you want to work on? Like, what do you enjoy? Because doing that kind of work, the work that you do when you don't have to, is what kind of work you're going to attract later, you know? So the kind of music that you'll work on.
Yeah,
I thought that was really cool.
I think, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's probably a good place to land the plane, because it kind of gets to an application that we typically have, which is just be mindful that you're slowly creating a thread that's going to trace. And you might have big divergences from that, but I don't think it's detrimental to have a mind towards your subject matter, because there's that way you can, like we mentioned before with taste, you can start developing your taste within that subject and learn what's been done, and that's going to help you. And I think it can also just give you a better sense of direction. So for application, I'm thinking some mindfulness of your subject. I mean, did you have something else for application in mind?
No, I think that's it. Just asking yourself what subjects you think you're drawn to, and then just doing what we're doing on this podcast, and also asking, okay, who are my favorite artists? And then that's a really good way to then just Google their name, like look through their body of work, and then you can just start to just
try to trace,
even in just the art of a lot of these things. If it's book covers or movie covers or album covers, it's like you start to see like, there's like okay, what's the theme? And sometimes that can suck you into like a genre focus. which obviously it's like with Christopher Nolan, it's like all, sci-fi and action adventure, but it's like there's something deeper, and looking for that thread, I think, is cool.
The John Mayer cover art breakdown. Is that going to be an episode? We could totally do that.
Breaking down our favorite album. Yeah, we need to start the YouTube channel first so we can do like visuals.
Disclosure, I sent Colby a unreleased John Mayer performance today that I just ran across
I still haven't
on YouTube.
Listened to that. I need to listen to it.
Yeah, you're going to have to listen to that. He's such an interesting performer. But we're scattering here at the end. But I think it's a great word to end on. Go out. Who are you admiring? What is their subject? And then kind of let that orientate you a little bit.
Love it. So before we head out here, let's do a quick quote of the week. Do you have something for us today?
I do. This is from Ernest Hemingway. You throw it all away and invent from what you know. I should have said that sooner. That's all there is to writing. So this is another version of writing what you know, but not quite. You invent from what you know. So maybe that is a nice formulation for us. You start there, but you just don't end there.
Love it. Let's end on that. That was great. Hey, thanks for listening to The Craft with Carter and Colby, where we share what we're learning about the creative process. If you're a writer, music producer, marketer, filmmaker, photographer, or you just love creativity, then this show is for you. Our cover art was designed by Elizabeth Newell. You can learn more about her work at elizabethnewelldesign.com. That's Elizabeth, Newell design.com. And you can follow her on Instagram at ElizabethIsADesigner. If you like the show, there's 3 things you can do to help us out. First, subscribe so you learn when we post new episodes. Second, send the link to one of your friends who you think would enjoy the show. Really, word of mouth is going to be the number one way we grow the show in any way. And 3, if you have a topic you want us to cover, or feedback about how we can improve the show, or comments on what we've said, you can respond to heycraftpodcast@gmail.com, heycraft podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.